So welcome back. I think we're on session 4, if I'm not mistaken. And what I'd like to do today, we're going to continue on this trek through early Christianity. I want to first, as I'm going to all the time do, because I think it's important to keep these things in the front of our mind, I want us to think about the basic elements of anti-Semitic discourse that appear over and over throughout the history of anti-Semitism, and predate, as we saw with Appian and Tacitus, even Christianity. So a reminder of the things that we're looking at are demonization, the deicide myth, which we're going to talk about in both of these in some small detail today, ritual slaughter, the wandering Jew, we're not going to get into that too much today, carnality, the poisoning of wells, and desecration of the host, in other words, harming Christians, disease, dirt, greed, global conspiracy, and bestialization, which is related to demonization. So as always, we want to look at those things and be aware of them. Now, before we started the class formally, Ron was asking about was commenting on some of the obsession of Christianity. Today, I think we're also going to see that part of the obsession that Christianity had with Judaism was interpreted later as being something that was critical of Jews. For instance, we're going to look at a passage from John, uh, very briefly, that only later was understood. Actually, it's a passage from Revelation that later was understood as being targeted towards Jews, when in reality, it may have actually been a Jew talking to Gentiles. But some of the language changes over time. But by and large, yes, they're engaged in a chess match for the first couple hundred years. And then once Christianity is ascending, it's no longer a chess match anymore. It's really the belittling of the people for reasons, theological and other reasons, the belittling of the people who rejected Jesus. We last week spoke about the woes that are reflected 10 themes in the New Testament. And I do really want to remind us of what they are as well, because we're going to see them throughout the session today. Real quickly, the Jews are culpable for crucifying Jesus, therefore deicide. The tribulations of the Jewish people throughout history are God's punishment for them for killing Jesus. That is something that is taken from the New Testament, but is not necessarily a major theme of the New Testament. So, for instance, you can imagine two people arguing, and that argument is recorded for all time, and later someone looks at one side of the argument and says, this everything that guy said is right, and we're going to take his track of thought. There may have been some of that. There may have been equals discussing this at some point, that later, when one becomes supersedes the other, or sees themselves as superseding the other, they become really a commandment almost, that you must always treat the Jews the way the interlocutor did in this particular discussion. So this is by means of saying not everyone who was talking about a Jew or this Jew or that Jew in the New Testament was talking about all Jews and for all time. They may have just had some issue at some point. But later on, that is taken to apply to all Jews. Judas is a good example of this. It's not clear that Judas was originally representing the entirety of the Jewish people, but Judas becomes the representative of the entirety of the Jewish people. Judas being, if you don't remember, the one who betrays Jesus to the Romans. So that's an example of that, or a discussion of the single person, maybe not an attack on the whole of Jewry, but it later becomes that. The third woe, that Jesus originally came to preach only to the Jews, but they rejected him and abandoned them for Gentiles instead. We're not going to study this little aside that I'm going to make right now, but you might come across it. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to review these woes, because I realized I couldn't address every little thing. There are, for instance, all kinds of weirdnesses in the New Testament, just like there are in the Hebrew Bible and every other kind of ancient literature. One of them is this sort of indecipherable uh, quirk of Mark. Mark being the earliest of the evangelists, the writers of the or the books of the Gospels. Remember, they're not named for some guy that we knew wrote them. They're just, those names are just attached to them. So Mark lives maybe around the time of the destruction of the temple, around 70. So this idea that Jesus originally came preached only to the Jews, Mark had a different issue altogether, but it again winds up playing into some anti-Semitic beliefs. Mark had an issue in writing this, that the first and second generation the second generation for sure of Jews who were his followers, by the third generation, they were gone. They didn't remember him anymore. He hadn't done any of the things that a Jewish Mashiach was supposed to do. So he didn't stick around as being particularly important. The Chabad rabbi is much more important. So they'll remember him for a long time. But I'll tell you now, I've talked to Chabad kids about the controversy over the Rebbe being the Mashiach, and they don't know what I'm talking about. It's been that far, it's become that irrelevant, other than that little group of people who still do it, and they're becoming, as one scholar at Columbia University, whose name is escaping me now, even though I read his book, they're becoming the new Christians, except the Rebbe is their Jesus. So what is Mark doing in his book? He's constantly telling his followers to keep everything a secret. Don't tell anyone you saw Jesus do that. Don't tell anyone that this happened or that happened. Why does he have this thing that's called the Messianic secret featured in his writings? Because he had to deal with Gentiles and others saying, "How come we never heard of this guy? If he's so freaking important, why didn't we ever hear of him?" And so, according to most scholars, he invents this thing called the Messianic secret. And I thought about looking into this more, but it just seems like in reviewing the woes, I can give you another illustration of how something that maybe wasn't that obsessed with disliking Jews became something that turned into dislike, or an excuse to dislike Jews, because later generations will read this Messianic secret as illustrating that Jews are really stupid, that Jews are ignorant. And in fact, some of the people that Mark is with actually don't see what Jesus is doing. They somehow miss it. But that was all a part of saying that Jesus's miracles were somehow only available to the people who had insight or were there or what have you, or it doesn't matter. Whatever reason Mark, and it's being debated and will ever forever be debated, whatever reason Mark invented the secret messianic, this messianic secret, it didn't have anything to do with wanting to stain future generations of Jews. That wasn't the goal, but it did. And that's another example of how things that maybe in the original were not so focused on Jew hatred became more fodder for Jew hatred. The arguments with the Pharisees, there's no sign that the early evangelists, the early gospel writers, had any desire to stain Jews forever on. That wasn't what they were doing. What they were doing was trying to show how their version of Judaism, because they saw themselves as sort of the new Jews, and most of them were Jews. The ones that when Jesus is having arguments, or Jesus's followers are having arguments with Pharisees, these are Jews talking to Jews. But later on we get a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. So you can see how the Judaization of the de-Judaization of Jesus came about, and we're going to talk about that at some point too. The number four woe number four was the children of Israel were God's original people by virtue of the ancient covenant, the ancient testament. And that they forfeited their chosenness. Again, there's more to this in the original theology, which is another reason I wanted to mention it today. If you were looking at this from the eyes of a first century Christian, they probably didn't say, "Oh, the Jews were no longer God's chosen people." Many of them would say, "Everybody is now God's chosen people." God experimented with the Jews, and the Jews failed, but not because they were terrible people, because we're Jews too, most of us. It's because it just didn't work to cleanse them of the sin that was passed down generation through generation from Adam to us. It's not, the law doesn't suffice. And Gentiles especially like that argument that the law doesn't suffice because they were being excused from the law. But it had more to do with the law and with human frailty than it did with Jews being bad. Later, it's about Jews being bad because the Jews still won't do it. And they're angry at us. Number 5, the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, repeatedly portrays the opaqueness and stubbornness of the Jewish people and their disloyalty to God. That's just a lie, because while it's there, it's not the main topic. We'll see in a few moments how Paul accuses the Jews of killing all their prophets. And that seems to be an insert into Pauline language from much, much later. So Paul the Jew probably didn't say that, someone else did. But it's also not true. That wasn't a characteristic of the stories. There were kings who did that, but the Jews aren't running around killing prophets all day and all night. That's not part of the story. Number 6, the Jewish Bible contains many predictions of the coming of Jesus, and the Jews are blind to the meaning of their own Bible. Well, yes, it does contain many predictions because, as I've explained to you in that one lesson we didn't put online, the one about the historicity of Jesus, the lessons of or the predictions of the coming of Jesus and many of the biographical details of what Jesus did were taken from Jewish scripture because they didn't remember or know what the hell it was Jesus did. And my favorite example always is the one where it's plainly taken from the Greek translation of the Bible, where if you read it in Greek only, some future helper, savior, whatever, king of the Jews is depicted as riding on 2 animals, going back and forth into Jerusalem. And that's a translation error that only the Greek has. And therefore, it sort of gives away the game that they're reading the Greek translation, done by Jews, by the way, but just not a terrific translation. And there's other mistakes like that too. So it wasn't that the Jews couldn't read their own Bible. It's that the people who wrote the New Testament wrote it using the Jewish Bible. And the Jews never did see these things because they weren't there until they made them be there. Number 7, by the time of Jesus's ministry, Judaism had ceased to be a living faith. That is clearly not true, but it was obviously a faith that was very much based upon law. That's what makes us in many ways a culture and a people, and not necessarily a faith. There's a lot of different ways to believe in God, even today in Judaism, or not for us. Number 8, Judaism's essence is a restrictive and burdensome legalism. Well, that one I'm not going to address. Some of us even say that, but it's not its essence, at least not for the people who practice it the way that my loved ones do. Christianity emphasizes love, while Judaism stands for justice and a God of wrath. I don't think either of those things were true then. I don't think they're true now. And I'm not exactly sure that that's what these early evangelists were saying, but there you have it. And finally, the Judaism's oppressiveness reflects the disposition of Jesus's opponents, called Pharisees, who in their teachings and behaviors are depicted as hypocrites. They were not hypocrites, and Jesus was probably one of them. Okay, so much for the woes. So let me share my screen now so we can look at text together. Any questions on the woes? Okay, you guys can see this? All right, so we read 2 rather longish passages here with this. One was the woes on the Pharisees. So we looked directly at that, and the experts of the law from Luke, which is the last of the 3 synoptic gospels, the oldest of them. And then a warning against hypocrisy by Matthew, who, even though he's the first in the order of the gospels, is not the oldest. And we went through those, and we landed here at Matthew 27. So what we're going to do now is take a look at the narrative of Jesus. This, I believe, was in fact, I'm certain of it, was the gospel that was used for Jesus Christ Superstar, and it's the one that's used in a lot of a lot of these modern dramatizations. And that's unfortunate because this is the one that is really the most difficult for Jews, has created the most difficulties for Jews. And they're the ones that talk about this, have a certain version. It's synoptic, so it doesn't not match what Mark and Luke say, but it really, Matthew really heavily concentrates on this theme and the story of how the Jews, beginning with Judas, betrayed Jesus, betrayed God, as it were. So from Matthew 27, we're going to read here a little bit about this faithless disciple, this guy named Judas. And Judas, by the way, does translate into Hebrew as Yehuda or Yehudi, you might say, which means Jew, but it's also a common name in Greek and Hebrew. And this is where this motif of greed and the payment appear first. Not in Mark, which is older, but in Matthew. Matthew's got all the worst stuff. And Matthew's also the one that all the passion plays are based on. And when Jesus Christ Superstar came out, which is essentially a passion play. You know, have you heard this term before, passion play? The Passion of Christ, right, is the crucifixion of Christ. These passion plays, particularly the ones that were performed regularly in Germany, and throughout Central Europe. But to this day, I think there's one there. You know, they've softened it from time to time, but they are really not good for the Jews. They are really, really not good for the Jews because this is the gospel they go by, and it's just the worst. And I'll point out some of the historical inaccuracies, but I think you all understand already, probably implicitly, that much of what's going to be described is not historically accurate. It was made up. So the details here that come out, beginning with this payment and the greed, they start to help form the stereotype of a venal and disloyal Jew. And as I said earlier, it's not that necessarily this is what Matthew was going for, although I think maybe this was what Matthew was going for in some sense too. He seems to have the biggest bone to pick with all the Jews who were not coming along on the program. Matthew's not Jewish, and he's from a later generation than Mark. Mark, we suspect, was Jewish. But again, there's no direct interpretation, no indication that the character of Judas was either invented or exists or was preserved, however you want to look at it, as to show the venality of the Jews. That is probably something that was just worked in. And I think we're looking at a sort of middle stage here in when it was worked in. It's some biblical scholars of the New Testament say that it's likely that Matthew inserted the reference to 30 pieces in order to link Judas's actions to something in the prophet, about the prophet Zechariah, where it talks about how, you know, the good guys or the future, this or that, will be sold out. And it doesn't even say by who. And this, again, an example of filling in a biographical point with something that they're reading into our Bible, not out of our Bible. This is the worst kind of, we learned two things in rabbinical school about interpretation. Exegesis, where you're taking the lesson out of the Bible, and eisegesis, where you're reading things into it. That's a lot murkier than that. And as humanists, we should all be prepared to understand that even reading things out of the Bible can be what Sherwin One used to call kosherizing, which means reading things into it. But here we're really talking about reading things into it, because when they have all these details that are taken from Isaiah about the suffering servant, or from Zechariah, and he was the one with the two animals that got mistranslated into two animals. He's talking about a future Jewish Mashiach, and it talks about, you know, somebody's going to sell him out. It doesn't necessarily explicitly say who, as I recall, but you know, he didn't have a detail, so he put it in there. He didn't mean to hurt all the Jews. Maybe he did, but I don't think so. It wound up having that effect. So here's our text. Early in the morning, all the chief priests, and they really get the worst of it, the priests, and the elders of the people made their plans to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Now, I should point out, and this is just a little bit of an aside, Pontius Pilate was not a friend of the Jews or anyone that was living under his rule. And that alone should be an example of what a silly story this is. Just completely historically inaccurate. But, what does this guy know? He's writing 40, 50 years later, and he's basing it on nothing. He's basing it on some oral stuff. He's basing it on Mark. He's basing it on things he reads in the Jewish Bible, in Greek. What happens next? When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So he literally goes and says he lied, which in a way makes him not the worst guy in the story. The worst guys in the story are the chief priests and the elders of the people, who may have also been like rabbis or Pharisees with that we don't know. And they turn him over to Pilate anyway. And here's where you start getting into collective guilt. So the next section we're going to read, I want to talk about it before we start reading it. It's known as the blood cry. It is Jesus coming before Pontius Pilate. It only exists in this form where all the people are saying one thing at once. Can you imagine all the Jews ever saying one thing at once? That's not even that's just bad science fiction. I don't know any Jews who do that. But they seem to be clamoring. They're not seem to be. They're depicted as clamoring for Jesus's crucifixion and insisting when Pilate, uncharacteristically for the historical Pilate that we know, demurs, they say all at once, as if they're reading from one of our Reformed prayer books, and they got to the responsive reading, his blood be on us and on our children. Now, this really, to me, is an indication of collective guilt that is now intended to be intergenerational. And this is where we start to get this, where this book starts to really be a problem, because it's going to spin out to a Christianity that is not the same Christianity that wrote it. The Christianity that wrote it is a very tiny persecuted group of people. The Christianity that will enforce it is a very powerful group of people. And that makes a very, very big difference. And so what happens is, whatever else they meant when they said his blood be on us and on our children, it might have just been their children. We don't know. It doesn't seem yet to be something so nefarious as, hey, in 2,000 years too, let's shove them in ovens. I don't think we're there. I don't think that this is the kind of interpretation it's fair to make. And therefore, I don't think it's always fair to call the New Testament an explicitly anti-Semitic work. It's more anti-Judaic in the sense that it opposes the policies, or the beliefs. But just as I said in our very first class, I personally am finding, I don't think it's a very far jump to go from anti-Zionism, Zionism's belief system within Judaism, and a popular one, a very strong one that Sherwin-Wine shared with Netanyahu and Shulamit Aloni and me and other people, to go from that to just kind of making it about all the Jews. And I'm going to show that on Friday night. In any case, they did make that leap, and they made it as a very powerful people. And thus it became that this blood cry was interpreted by Christians to mean all Jews, and that it also meant, therefore, that all Jews were accountable for Jesus's death. So the earliest record of this belief, it's not entirely clear to us when they made this leap with this particular verse, when it stopped being just about the folks that were present and it started being about all the Jews. But my best guess is that this really, and I'll talk about it a little bit later when I talk about Constantine, it really happened when Christianity took power. And though it is quoted or put into the mouth of Paul, who is the earliest writer in the New Testament. He's not one of the evangelists, that doesn't write a gospel, but it's put there early. I think it's inserted later on, where he also proclaims for the Jews, something very unlikely for him to do. He was a Jew. He would not have done that. It would have gone against his entire purpose, which is to get the Jews at first to believe that Jesus was the sort of the Hellenistic Mashiach, the one who was going to clear their sin away. They were perfectly happy doing it once a year on Yom Kippur. They didn't need somebody to do it for them purposely. So that quote that we'll look at in a few minutes is a little bit questionable, but I think it was really when they took power that happened. There was a fellow named Justin the Martyr. He's a second generation Christian philosopher. By the time we get to him, it's pretty clear. He says the Jews and the elders and the priests, they came to know this wrong that they had done for themselves and for every Jew who came along later on. And we've been suffering with this cry of deicide for a very long time. Anybody know when it started to diminish? I mean, it's not gone entirely. I'm sure Mel Gibson, absolutely believes it. Does anybody know when this started to diminish? It was in 1965 with the Nostra Aetate, which was a very, very, very detailed, complete revolution of liturgy and belief and everything else that the Roman Catholic Church underwent. They're still experiencing the repercussions of it to this day, and there's still opposition to much of what happened. It was the first time the collective guilt of the Jews was explicitly rejected by the church, and it did eventually have a lot of I would say power to get rid of some of that really virile anti-Semitism that Catholicism had spread. Didn't do a lot for everybody else, but where does this really come from then? This idea of blood upon yourself? Again, it probably took it from all kinds of things in the Hebrew scriptures, where people are told that if you do something bad, you're going to bring innocent blood on yourselves, and your kids are going to suffer. And there are varying attitudes that the Tanakh has, the Hebrew scriptures have, about whether or not our sins go down to the next generation or we alone are the ones who suffer. That's a whole big thing that rabbis talk about every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, if they don't have the privilege and pleasure of being a humanistic rabbi and not having to deal with all that bullshit. But that's another story. All right, let's read it. Let me pull it up here. Okay, so Jesus, as you know, is brought before the governor, brought before Pilate. And Pilate, the governor, asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" I'm not even going to get into what this was supposed to mean, but it's more correct. I know I am getting into it even after I said that. It is a more correct understanding of what some Jews might have felt Jesus was. Because if you're the Mashiach, in Jewish terms, you're the anointed one. You're the guy who gets the oil and gets to be the descendant of David and bring on the redemption of the Jews, the earthly redemption of the Jews, not the salvation from sin, which the Hellenists and the Jews among them believed. So it's just interesting that we do get little glimpses into what maybe really was going on here. It's not even clear that Jesus is in his generation believed he was such a thing. He might have viewed himself as having more of an Elijah role. You all know what Elijah's job is. He's the herald, the person who's going to announce the coming of the Mashiach, not the Mashiach himself. But anyway, Jesus replies, "You have said so." When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he had given no answer. Then Pilate asked him, it's a previous scene. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now, in its actual historical, as much as we can recreate an historical event here with Jesus, what is probably going on is that this is undoubtedly not Pilate, but Jesus was probably one of a varying group of people or groups of people who were in a big rebellion mode against Rome. And their rebellion was not a rebellion of the arms. Their rebellion was a rebellion of the spirit. They believed God would send a Mashiach and it would take care of the whole thing. Not the way the Christians will later take this story and make it a Mashiach that's a Messiah that's a Christos who will purify your being of sin. And then we get to this lovely story, which seems to be 100% fictional and does not do any good for our heroes here. It was the governor's custom at the festival, I don't know that that's true either, to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. And the question of whether his name was really Jesus or not comes up all the time. But Barabbas could mean anything. It just basically means son of a father. So if there was any truth to the story, it probably started out as some guy. That may have been the closest. Not well known. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who was called the Messiah?" As if Pilate would say such a thing. For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. When Pilate, while Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." So why all of a sudden does Pilate become so amenable to Jesus? It's because his wife is about to convert to Christianity. I mean, that's you have to read these things with a little bit of humor. And anybody who's Christian who's watching this, he also needs to understand that I do the same thing with the Jewish scriptures. I once got ripped to shreds by a 13-year-old that I was asked to come talk about Jews for Jesus. She says, "Oh, you're making fun of their Bible." And I said, "You should come to the classes I do on ours." I'm not, it pales in comparison to what I do to Moses and all our folks. But a lot of rabbis, our scriptures are untouchable in that way, but the Christian scriptures are up for grabs, right? So what happens next? I'm trying to scroll two texts at the same time. Um, the chief priests and elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. And he said again, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" And they continue to say Barabbas. So they don't really know who he is. Um, "What shall I do then with this Jesus who was called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." And then that becomes a big line in Jesus Christ Superstar, of course. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate, like he would give a shit. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility," which of course is the silliest thing. And then what happens is we see this quote repeated, and this comes from Deuteronomy and other places in the Bible, but for it to be inserted here, it's possible to question whether this meant just them, which I think it did, or they're all of us, all we Jews who were going to come later. I think it meant just them, because I don't think this was an argument between Christians and all the Jews in the world. But very, very soon, it would mean all of us to our detriment. "His blood is on us and on our children," they all said. Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed over him to be crucified. And then we get the famous scene of Jesus going through the city of Jerusalem, dragging his cross. The steps of the cross. If you've ever been to the old city, the Christian quarter is basically built around this. A little archaeological note: the old city of Jerusalem, both the Muslim quarter and the Christian quarter, for sure, were not inside the city walls at that time. So if you've ever pictured where the crucifixion took place, and you saw that it was out in a hilly area, and then you've gone to Jerusalem and you saw there was a big church set on top of it in the old city, that's because the walls of the old city as we have them now are the Ottoman walls. And so they went further to the north than the city was during the time of the rabbis. And if you ever want to see some good models of how all that looked, um, the former model of Jerusalem that used to be at the Holy Land Hotel. Anybody ever see this on your trips at the Holy Land Hotel? It was the only reason anybody ever went there. And the Holy Land Hotel in Hebrew is called the Holy Land Hotel, actually written out in Hebrew letters, Holy Land. But they moved it, fortunately, when that hotel closed, and they built a monstrous looking condominium project, which is one of the most horrible things that's ever been done to Jerusalem in thousands of years. And that's saying something. They moved it down to the Israel Museum, and it is now near the Shrine of the Book. And they made it much more detailed and accurate. And I highly recommend taking a look at it. It is Jesus at the time. It is Jerusalem at the time of the Second Temple, and that's when Jesus was living. So Christians love to go visit it. It's a miniature, but it's huge. So hopefully most of you have seen that, and the work that's been done on it, but now by scholars to bring it up to the standards of a museum is really something, and it's just one of my favorite places to visit. All right, let's now move on. I mentioned earlier that this idea of the deicide of the blood of people of the Jews, uh, the blood being on their children, including us now, that this was something that really became emphasized in the first to second century. And so while I don't believe that this quote is all genuinely Paul, it doesn't matter because it's genuinely New Testament. And that's what's important here. So, what did Paul have in mind when he was writing about the wrath of God coming on the Jews? Well, he was writing this in the year 50. Um, I think that he was maybe looking at the fact that a lot of Jews were under threat. The war was still 20 years away, though. So, I don't think he had anything terrible in mind. I don't think he wrote it. What does it say? All right, so he's writing this, he wrote these epistles, these notes, which are basically little sermons, and not all of them are genuinely Pauline. The Thessalonians, I believe, is considered to be, with the exception of some of these editions. And you can never know exactly, but the language sometimes changes, and I suppose people who know Greek know what is and isn't legitimate. But he says to them, "For you, brothers, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea." When they say churches of God, they mean, the word church doesn't really apply to, we're not talking about a church with a little cross and steeple and everything. We're talking about gatherings of people in belief of the Christ. The ones in Judea were not really the best examples because these were the ones that were comprised of Jews, and the Jews were losing their patience for Jesus to come back. That's why there's no second, third generation of actual Christian Jews. The Jewish Christians we have today, the Christian Jews, Hebrew Jews, whatever you want to call them, or Hebrew Christians, they've gone under a number of names, most famously for us, Jews for Jesus. They have nothing in common with these people. These were folks who, like the early Chabadniks, who maybe thought the Rebbe was the Mashiach. There were a few of them who really realized the error of their ways. And how did they realize the error of his ways? Well, he died. All of the Chabadniks thought he was potentially the Mashiach until he died. The ones who believed he was the Mashiach after he died, they were the ones who sort of got drummed out. And the longer they did this, the more Christian and weirdly Christian the Rebbe looked in their eyes. But they're such a tiny minority now. And they've been declared by a lot of scholars to be so outside of any normative kind of Judaism. The secular Jews, the atheists, they'll take us because we're not really we're not worshiping a brand new God. We're just not maybe treating Yahweh right. But there's plenty of room for that in Judaism and Jewish culture. But this is the churches in Judea were not like that. They were groups of people. It's reflected in the book. The book by Stein is A Driven Leaf. He has an encounter. The protagonist of the book has a Acher, the heretic, has an encounter with these people, and really, by the time that generation is dead, they're gone. Anyway, so he said, "You brothers became imitators of these Jews who were kind of Christ believers in Judea, for you suffered the same things from your own countrymen as they did from the Jews." And here's where the language seems to change, "who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out." Now, he's making a leap here, a switch here that doesn't even sound like it's in context. At one moment, he's talking about something, and now he's talking about something else. He's talking about collective guilt. And they displease God. And here's where it becomes problematic. They oppose all mankind by hindering us from speaking to the Gentiles that they might be saved. There's no record that these first generation Christians who were contemporaries of Paul, that they ever told him that he couldn't talk to anyone else. They argued about a lot of things. The Jews wanted to continue to be loyal to the halakha, the Jewish law. And Paul said, yes, maybe you should be. You're still in that covenant. It's the Gentiles that aren't. So they weren't really even at each other's throats about that. But here we have a Paul that is doing serious damage to you and me in the 21st century, and to Jews who have come before us. by creating and emphasizing this idea of deicide. And I can't even begin, it's why I did a whole class on this, maybe a class and a half, on talking about deicide and talking about this collective guilt. Because for the Christians, this gave them all kinds of permission. So it says, by hindering us from speaking to the Gentiles that they might be saved, so as always to fill up the measure of their sins. So as always to fill up the measure of their sins. But wrath has come upon them at last. So while I'm not, the biggest fan of Paul, there's a lot of Christians that aren't the biggest fan of Paul either in some ways. It is not at all historically correct to say that he brought this on the Jews. But certainly by the time we get to Constantine or Justin the Martyr, who I spoke about a moment ago, we absolutely have this fateful idea that the Jews killed both the Lord and all the prophets that lie that that's what the Jews were doing back in the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh. I'm just going to say Tanakh from now on. I think you guys know what it means. In the Tanakh, by no means true. And the worst thing he could possibly say, that they oppose all mankind. We are the enemies of humanity. Can you imagine? And that has been something that until 1965 was not rectified. While triumphantly celebrating God's punishment of them, he gives rise to this untold misery, as somebody wrote, a scholar that I read, upon the Jewish people as Christ killers. And I know many of you are of a generation, of an age that you were accused of this. You probably had a run-in at some point. Who didn't? Who had a run-in with someone who called them a Christ killer? No, really? That few of us? I certainly heard it. I certainly heard it when I was a kid, that I was a Christ killer in Texas, not in Miami. And you hear it to this day all the time. So, all right. So now let's move on. Let's move on. We're going to move on to the demonic aspect of the Jews that's suggested in the New Testament. So let me talk about John really quickly. John is a very, very strange guy in the New Testament. He is not one of the synoptic gospels. I'm not going to get into all of the controversies about John among Christians, why he was preserved, how he was preserved, and so forth, because he does seem in some of his theology to contradict other things. It's not our interest. It's not what this course is about. I want to start out also by pointing out that there's a lot of things that are attributed, especially in terms of Jew hating, to John. There's at least a couple of things that he didn't do that are falsely attributed to him, but he did enough. He did enough. One of the things that's attributed to him that's not true is that, well, the first part is that he wrote the book of Revelation. He didn't write the book of Revelation. There's two different authors of the book of Revelation, as far as I know, from my New Testament teachers, but they're both attributed to this sort of anonymous John. But there he talks about the synagogue of Satan. As it turns out, that book may have actually been written by a Jew. And Satan in Jewish lore, original Jewish lore, Satan is the angel who works for God, who challenges the people, so he tests them. So when you hear the synagogue of Satan, that is not a legit thing that John did. But what we got is better or worse, and here it is. So he's considered one of the gospels because it's telling a life story of Jesus. He's not a synoptic gospel because it's not told in the same order. And it's also got a lot of mysticism in it and all kinds of stuff that I am not the expert on. And you can go, if you're that interested in John, and study with someone else. But he does have similar scenes of Jesus speaking to Pharisees. He is also late. So we're going to assume increased hostility. He's Gentile. That also brings about increased hostility. And he places Jesus having this argument with Pharisees with a really very, very much like a Matthew or even a Mark, but more of a Matthew style of Pharisee. He says, Jesus is supposed to have said, I know that you are descendants of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me because my word finds no place in you. I speak of what I have seen with my father, and you do what you have heard from your father. They answered him, Abraham is our father. And Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did. Now, I want you to just, even before I read the next part, which is the most troublesome part, to see the way that John characterizes Jesus speaking to the Pharisees, to the rabbis. This is not the way he's characterized as speaking to people who knew who these people were. In some ways, he is responsible for sort of tearing Jesus away from his own people. They're foreign to him, and he's foreign to them. This is almost, not quite, because you can't read the whole book and think that it is, the Gentilization of Jesus. So notice that first, because it's the only way you get into this next part. If you're not Abraham's father, like Abraham's children, I am, he says, you are of your father, the devil. And now this is a Greek devil. This is not Satan, the Jewish angel of the book of Job. This is a Greek devil. This is Lucifer, if you will, the fallen angel. That's later mythology, but you can still kind of relate it in your knowledge, which is, you know, all of us, our knowledge is not bad, and not that bad about what the devil means, especially to Christianity, the ruler of hell. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and has nothing to do with the truth, because there is no truth in him. Could this be Cain? Possibly. Cain was the first, truly murderous person in the Bible. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is you are not of God. All right. So there's a Jewish scholar of the New Testament, Adele Reinhardt, has written about this. She sums up that Jesus in this passage is portrayed and depicted as accusing the Jews of having the devil as their father because of the murderous intentions and the rejection of the claims to be the Son of God. Now, she notes that some scholars do attempt to excuse this language on the grounds that it merely reflects the heightened emotions of an inner Jewish squabble. But I would argue that in Mark and Matthew, where we read the squabbles, even in Paul, where we hear about the squabbles are squabbles. They're not great, but they're squabbles. They are, arguments that Jews might have with each other. What time is it? No, I still have time. Okay, the arguments I have Jews. That's not what this looks like. And she says, and she continues by saying that the integral connection of the verse to the gospel's major theological claims argue against this softer reading. John 8:44, which is the passage in question, participates in the gospel's rhetoric of binary opposition. This gospel, the Gospel of John, which features binary opposition, according to which non-Christ confessing Jews are all associated with a full range of negative images: darkness, flesh, death, and the devil. In contrast to Christ confessors, which I believe in the imagination of John, though she doesn't say it specifically here, are really all the Gentiles who believe in Christ. And they are identified with light, spirit, life, and God. And I don't think I have to tell you that this verse, this passage, is one of the single most important in the history of Christian anti-Semitism. You cannot understand why they are who they are with regard and relationship to us without understanding this. So here we've seen today that whoever, and last session, that whoever and whatever the arguments were among the Christ-believing Gentiles and Jews first, and other Jews who didn't believe those Jews, it evolved into something very different. It evolved really into an argument between from an argument between Jews into a series of libelous tales and accusations that, whether they're being misread or not, and I guess it depends on how much you love Jesus in the New Testament, it seems to me that you would want to be critical of this. And they have as there are plenty of Christians who engage in critical study of the Bible, just like we do critical study of the Torah. But just as a Reform rabbi, even a Reform rabbi, is going to look at the Torah as being inspired by God, even if they disagree with, a lot of passages in it. They're, well, that's from its time. Christians are on that track too. They have to do this. The one little extra out that they get, the one little extra open door is that they can claim that, well, these people, we know who they were and they were people of their time. And by know who they were, we don't really know who they were because they're anonymous texts, but we know the times they lived in. Okay, what we're going to do next time is we're going to spend a very few moments talking about the rise of Christianity, because this isn't a course in the history of Christianity. And you already know it got big, so I don't have to tell you how. You can take another course about that. But we're going to take a little trip from there, and we're going to arrive in medieval times, and not the fun one where you get to go and watch the waiters and waitresses jousting with each other, but the ones that were just horrible for the Jews, and that in many ways did not end until the Holocaust, and in some quarters are still very much alive, though obviously not in the way that they sort of ruled the thinking of an entire continent and more for well over 1,000, pushing on 1,500 years. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you next week.